I think that we generally think that sticking to things is the courageous act. I think very often the more courageous act is quitting because that's the scarier one. For one thing, often when we're quitting, we don't know what we're going to go do, right? So we're dealing with the unknown. And there's a saying, the devil we know versus the devil we don't, that we prefer the thing we're doing, even if it's very bad, to the thing we're not doing because we don't know.
Welcome to The First 2 Years, an early careers podcast from the Ken. I'm Akshay Chandrasekharan. Have you ever struggled with knowing when to walk away from a job? It's like you know you're not happy with where you are, but you're scared about taking that next step because you don't entirely know what the future holds. This is especially harder to do when you're starting out. You don't have the benefit of hindsight or years of experience to leverage, and every decision you make, whether to stay or to quit, feels like this big life-changing decision, and you want to get it right. You don't want to have regrets. And now this is a loop, right? You've overthunk it and you've reached a stage called decision fatigue, where you just feel stuck and stagnant. Does this all sound too familiar to you? Well, many of our listeners are in the same situation.
The thing is that having been a professional poker player, the science did not surprise me that quitting is so hard because I had experienced that, right? Not just myself, right? That feeling of like not wanting to fold, but like really watching other people make those decisions very poorly.
That's our expert, Annie Duke. She knows a lot about making decisions under pressure, and the reason why is because she's a professional poker player. She's actually won more than $4 million playing poker, and in poker, knowing when to fold separates elite players from amateurs. Elite players were good at exercising the opportunity to quit way more than the amateurs. They were more flexible to changing their mind as and when they received new information. That is, as and when they were dealt with new cards. But as we'll hear, it's not just the amateur poker players. In the face of tough decisions, they're all terrible quitters. And that is significantly holding us back. So on today's show, we're going to hear from Annie, a decision strategist, an author, and business consultant about not just quitting, but quitting in time, and how that is going to set you up for success in the long term. She joined me on a video call from the US and helped me solve this problem that is on a lot of your minds. This episode is going to change the way you think about quitting and kind of blow your mind in a way. Stay tuned. So, Annie, I think just a disclaimer, right? My questions are probably going to sound elementary to you because you have researched and studied decision making a lot. But I'm going to be a stand in for my listener, and I'm going to ask you questions that is probably on their minds. So, bear with me if some of it is too elementary. But the first question that I have for you is that in your early career, when you're starting out, you're doing everything almost for the first time, whether it's quitting a job or choosing one company over the other, evaluating these options and all of that, right? It's hard to have strong convictions when you're making these decisions because you always feel like you don't know enough, right? And there is always this element of uncertainty. You don't know how these decisions are going to turn out. So, will I regret this? Will I not regret this? Am I making these am I making informed choices? These things kind of torment you in a way. So how do you make decisions when you don't have years of experience to fall back on?
There's a really important principle about quitting, which has to do with the interaction between quitting and time. So let's imagine you go on vacation and it's a place you've never been before, and you're going to be there for 7 nights.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you've never been there before.
Got it.
First night, you go to a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to go back to that restaurant the second night? No, right? Because you're exploring.
Yeah.
So you're going to go and try another restaurant the second night and probably another restaurant the third night. It's a new place.
Yeah.
But what are you going to do on your last night? Are you going to go and try something new? Or are you going to go back to the best restaurant that you
I'm
tried
going to go
out of
back
the
to the
six?
best
You are.
restaurant and finish it
Why?
off
Because you
in
have
a,
no more time.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So let's take that to career, right?
Mm, mm,
So if I'm very close to retirement, I
mm,
should stay at the restaurant I like, right?
mm,
So that's not a great time to quit
mm.
because there's not very much clock left. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
got it.
so in that particular case, you probably wouldn't quit unless you knew for certain you had an opportunity in hand that was going to make you a lot of money or be way better than the thing that you're already doing. You would have to be pretty certain.
Mm,
But if you're in your 20s, it's like the first night of your vacation. And so
mm,
that is actually exactly the time when you can do a lot more exploration. So now let's think about this restaurant thing and divide it into two ideas. One is exploration, which we can think of as sampling,
mm-hmm.
right? Trying different things
Things.
to try
Yeah.
to figure out what do I like.
Yep.
Okay. And then there's exploitation. This
Mm-hmm.
this is not this is a neutral
Yeah.
word as I'm using it. It doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
negative connotations. What it means is sticking to the thing that I know is working. But the amount of certainty that someone who's 25 needs to say, you know what, I think I want to try something else and go start a new career is very different than the amount of certainty that someone who's 55 needs. Because the 55-year-old doesn't have as much time. They're at the end of their vacation, work wise, not life wise, but work wise. So I think that's really important. So I think you've got to change that mindset and approach it that way.
Yeah. It's kind of like you don't have anything to lose.
So in your 20s, explore. What's the penalty? Do you know what I mean? Like, that's the way that you should think about it. Now, that doesn't mean that I want you to quit your job because you have a bad day, right? I mean, we need to have better reasons than that. And we can talk about that. But I think that, for people who are younger, what you should think about is that this is the time when you should be free. You should feel very free to switch around because you're at the beginning of your vacation. You should be trying all sorts of restaurants. Why not? You've never been to the place, right? Explore, try stuff that you like. If you should always be looking for what's on the horizon. I think you should be jumping around. What's a reasonable amount of job switching to do in your 20s that's going to look okay on your resume? Right? So don't use it as a rationalization. Actually go ask an expert, how much switching can I do that my resume can tolerate? And then honestly, within that, you should probably be switching a lot unless you really find something that you love, which makes you lucky that you do. So I think that's number one, is to get into that sampling mode.
But it's very hard to uh, stick to that because the society is always like people who know what they want to do and are passionate about it from the get go are rewarded so much. So you almost feel like, oh, cross pollinating ideas, trying these bunch of things, having multiple interests sort of feels wrong, at some level.
Yeah, but the thing is that I'm not sure that people who it out early on are actually rewarded. I mean, I think we have this problem on both sides of the equation because I can give you all sorts of examples of people who didn't make it until they were in their 40s. In terms of like renown, there's an actress named Judi Dench who, I think people sort of figured out who she was in her 50s. I think the problem is that there's something called survivorship bias. And I think this is one of the most destructive biases for decision making and forecasting and happiness. And basically, simply put, and it's in the name, is we have a bias to pay attention to the survivors, and we don't really take into account when we're trying to figure out like what's a good thing to do. The people who don't make it. This is a big problem, like for people who are in startups, right? Who are like founders, who are hearing about these founders who stuck to it, even though everybody said this isn't something you should stick to. And, they mortgaged their house and they borrowed all their parents' money and, and in the end, they made it. right? And it's like, yeah, that's true. They had a lot of people telling them it wasn't going to work. And they did make it, but there are thousands of people who did the same thing who ended up in disastrous debt with no house and bankrupting their parents. And, I think the issue is that you can't, what survivorship bias does is it creates a rationalization for ignoring real and legitimate feedback from the world, right? That's where I think, like, when you look at this idea that, oh, the people who figure it out early get really rewarded, you know what? I don't know if that's true, right? Like, I would have to look at the data compared to people who figure it out in their 30s or in their 40s, or who ends up happier in the long run. People who are in the same career and same job for 30 years, or people who switch around as their interests change. I don't know the data on that, but I would suspect it's the latter, but I don't know for sure.
One of the most common reasons people give to not make these decisions in time is that I have put so many years into this job, and now if I walk away, it's all going to go to waste. You feel like you want to time it right. You want to not quit at a time when you are about to grow. Like, the timing is such a difficult thing to understand. And also, quitting feels so much like giving up. It feels like I'm signaling to the world that I don't have the courage to stick with it, or to do something, or see it through, and all of that. Like, what does it say about me that I'm quitting? So it always feels like giving up, and it always feels like it's too soon to give up.
I think that we generally think that sticking to things is the courageous act. I think very often the more courageous act is quitting, because that's the scarier one. For one thing, often when we're quitting, we don't know what we're going to go do, right? So we're dealing with the unknown. And there's a saying, the devil we know versus the devil we don't, that we prefer the thing we're doing, even if it's very bad, to the thing we're not doing because we don't know. One of my favorite stories in the book is actually about a doctor who was an emergency room doctor, and she hated her job. And she wrote me out of the blue and just said, hey, I heard you on a podcast talking about quitting. This was before I'd published the book, talking about quitting. And I was hoping you could help me with this decision. So I talked to her, and man, she really had a lot of things to say about how much she hated her job. So much so that I was quite confused as to why she was asking me about whether she should quit it. And she actually had another job that she had been offered. And I said to her, well, okay, why aren't you quitting your job? Like, I'm just curious as to, you've told me all these things about why you're miserable. Why aren't you quitting? And she said, I think this is why I think it's courageous to quit. She said, but what if I hate that job too? And that's this ambiguity, right? Like the unknown, like what if that one's bad too? And we're very scared of uncertainty. So we'd rather be in the thing that we're certain about, even if we're certain it's bad, than move to something that we're uncertain about. So what I said to her was, okay, it's a year from now. What are the chances that you're happy? And she said, 0. And I said, okay, it's a year from now. You take this new job. What are the chances you're happy? And she said, I don't know, 50%. And I was like, okay, is 50% greater than 0? And she said, yes. And she quit.
Oh, I love that story, Annie, because so many of us are stuck like that doctor, right? In a neutral state, and you're always doubting yourself and waiting for the solution to magically appear. Like, also, when you're giving percentages to your decisions, right? Like, it makes you realize that yes, you're 50% uncertain about what the future outcome is going to be, but you're also 100% certain that this is not where you want to be, right? And so it automatically makes it easier to evaluate and weigh. Like, you never look at it like that. So I love that story. But is there more? Are there any more strategies that will help me work through these decisions, if you'd like to share?
So one trick is to do what I did with her, which is to think about what we call expected value. Like what's actually going to cause you to gain ground the most. And that's all I did. I said, you stay in your job. It's a year from now. What's the probability you're happy? So notice I'm skipping over 365 tomorrows there. And that got her to see, the chances are 0. So what, and then I said, okay, it's 365 tomorrows from now and you're in the new job. What are the chances you're happy? And she said 50%. So that's number one, is look, tomorrow is when we're facing tomorrow, right? But if we can sort of project ourselves into the future, it's actually much easier to see that you should quit. We're much more rational about a future version of ourselves than we are about the version that exists today. One of the things that I try to get people to do is to set a deadline, right? You're unhappy. How long are you okay being in this state? Like, how long are you okay being unhappy? So let's say that they say 6 weeks, right? Okay. So imagine it's 6 weeks from now, right? What does happy look like? What does unhappy look like? Write those things down. Make those what we call kill criteria or exit criteria or quit criteria. I like kill criteria. Um, and then figure out over the next 6 weeks what you need to do in order to achieve the good version of the world. Right? Now, what will usually happen there is people will figure out there's nothing I can do over the next 6 weeks that will help me to achieve the good version of the world because I'm miserable doing what I'm doing. And as I think about these criteria for happiness, I'm never going to achieve them. And so I ought to just quit now.
Yeah, working with a deadline makes a lot of sense to me, right? Because you're no longer working on best effort basis. You're sort of putting a concrete deadline to it and working backwards. But it's also a deadline set by me, and it's incumbent on me to see it through. So what if I just choose to ignore it? It's convenient for me to ignore it, so I choose to ignore it, and I slip back to like familiar patterns and like basically not make the decision.
Let's say that you don't do that. Still set those criteria for 6 weeks from now. And then this is really important. Share them with somebody who will hold you accountable to them. It's very important. And now you've got two things going for you. You've got future you, so that helps. But then you also have somebody else who is going to be more objective because it's not their tomorrow. It's not their sunk costs. It's not their effort and time and attention and everything that they've put into it. It's not their fear of the unknown. And I think that we can all sort of intuit that, right? That when we are looking at somebody else who's in a situation where they're miserable, whether it's in a relationship or a job or whatever, we can see so clearly that they should be quitting, but they can't see it. Okay, so that means people can see that for you too. So go find those people to help you with those decisions as well. And that gets you out of like, but I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow.
Do people ever regret quitting? I asked Annie. Coming up after the break.
Hi, we have an exciting announcement to make. If you're a regular listener, you would know that the Ken's podcasts have hit many milestones this year. From Daybreak crossing 1 million downloads to the launch of our first ever premium podcast, 2x2. We want to keep this momentum going. And for that, we are looking for talented people to join our team. We're looking for a podcast producer to help us produce great narrative-driven shows at the intersection of journalism and business. We're also looking for an audio journalist who has covered one or more business sectors, ideally careers or education or tech and startups for at least 2 years. If you fit the bill or if you know anybody who does, please check out the link in the show notes. And now, back to the episode.
I think the pressure of getting this decision right also comes from the possibility that you might regret it going forward. Right? And you have spoken to so many people at different stages of their career, both successful and probably not successful, in pursuit of writing this book, I'm assuming. So, what have you noticed in terms of like, do people ever regret quitting, Annie?
I'm sure, yeah, I'm sure there are absolutely people who regret quitting. I'm sure that's true. But I think that what we need to remember is that what you have to look at is what happens on average, right?
Yeah.
So when you look at the data, and Stephen Levitt has some wonderful data on this, what you see is that the data very strongly shows
Freakonomics, Stephen Levitt, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
From
yeah,
Freakonomics. So what he showed was that when people are facing a really big life decision about whether to stick or quit, and you ask them to give sort of their level of happiness at that moment, that they're thinking about that, and then literally they go and flip a coin to decide whether they're going to stick or quit, which seems weird, but it's not actually that weird because they must be experiencing that as a close call at that point. So because they know they're going to flip a coin. So let's just kind of get the logic here, right? You don't know whether to stay in your job or quit. You're willing to go and flip a coin, which is 50-50. You must think it's 50-50 about whether you should quit or stick, right? You must think that's a 50-50 decision. Otherwise, you wouldn't be willing to flip a coin. So what you're saying is, what all the people who are doing this are saying is, I think if there's a 50% chance I'll be happier if I stick, there's a 50% chance I'll be happier if I quit. That's why I'm going to flip a coin. What that means is that whatever the coin tells you to do, we ought to expect that half of the quitters are happier and half of them are sadder when we ask them later. And half of the stickers are happier and half of the stickers are sadder, because that's what we, expect, right? But when you actually check in with them 6 months later, it turns out the quitters are happier. So what does that tell us? That people are quitting too late, because when they experience that as 50-50, it's not even close to 50-50. It's probably like 80-20, right? That you ought to be quitting. And so we know that people are getting to that decision way too late. They're just taking a long time to get to it.
What would you tell, say, Annie of 20 years old, knowing what you know now, about thinking in bets about your career? Like,
yeah, I always find these questions very difficult, but I think many 20-year-olds, me included, felt like you should know what you want to do at that time. That you should have a clear plan, and somehow you were failing if you didn't feel like you had found a passion, or that actually there's a lot of advice about your work needs to be your passion also. And I think that's really unfair advice. I think for some people, those two things merge, but for other people, their work funds their passion, which is a totally legitimate way to
look at
approach
life.
Work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this idea that work and passion need to merge together, I think creates a lot of unhappiness. So, I think that I was in that category of feeling like work needed to be passion, which puts a lot of pressure on you, right? And it also stops you from exploring sort of like passions outside of work, which I think is bad. And that I really needed to have it figured out, and that I was failing if I didn't know exactly. Yeah. And I think that what that caused me to do at the time was to engage with kind of the first thing that I was getting positive feedback on, and that I was good at, right? Because I felt like I had to know. So this idea of like sampling a bunch of stuff sort of went out the window. And I think that you, particularly at that age, you should be sampling a bunch of stuff. Yeah. I wish that I'd known that you will actually change. It's totally fine to change what you do a lot.
Yeah.
Right. That because certainly I did that, right? So some of this is sort of hindsight, but that you may like one thing in your 20s and then switch to another thing, and that's also totally fine. I think those are the things probably that I would really want 20-year-old me to know. I think it would have made me less anxious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Annie. That brings us to the end of our conversation. And I think this conversation sort of changed my whole perspective about quitting. And I'm a huge fan of all three of your books, especially Thinking in Bed. So I'm really glad that you consented to doing this interview and made the time for it. And I'm really glad to have had this conversation with you.
Yes, it was totally fun. It was a very different kind of conversation than I normally have. It was excellent. Yeah.
Oh, wait. In what ways?
Well, you were just asking me a lot of stuff about like early career advice. And I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. No, I don't really, most people don't ask me about that. I talk to a lot of executives who are very far along in their career.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for doing this.
That was so much fun. Thank you so much.
The First 2 Years is an early careers podcast from the Ken. The show is written, hosted, and produced by me, Akshay Chandrasekharan, with audio engineering by Rajiv CN. Thanks for listening. See you next Tuesday.